The morning Victoria finally snapped, it didn't end Oppos. T looked like a scene from a movie. It looked like a glitch in reality. A high-end suburban nightmare unfolding in 4K resolution at 6:42 a.m. while the mist was still hugging the surface of Mirror Lake. I remember the air was so sharp it felt like breathing glass. And then came that sound, a high-pitched, jagged screech that cut right through the rhythmic thud of my construction crew's post-driver. Victoria burst out of her glass and steel fortress. That $2 million architectural ego trip she called a home, wearing nothing but a silk robe and a look of pure, unadulterated homicidal mania. Her hair, which usually looked like it had been sculpted by a team of professionals, was a bird's nest, and her designer slippers were sinking inch-deep into the mud of the rose garden she spent 10 grand on just last spring. And quote, "Stop. You stop this right now." And quote, she was screaming, her voice cracking like a cheap speaker pushed too far, but my guys didn't in Oppos. T stopped because the steel posts were already flying, slamming into the dirt and slicing clean through the middle of her prize-winning floribundas. Petals were exploding everywhere like red confetti, raining down on her white robe until she looked like some sort of deranged Valentine's Day mascot losing her mind in the dirt. I just sat there on my porch, wrapped in a fleece blanket with a steaming mug of black coffee, watching her mascara run in long, dark rivers down her face while she clawed at the half-built fence like a trapped animal. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, but to understand why a guy like me, a 52-year-old retired diesel mechanic who just wanted to fish in peace, would do something this cold, you have to understand the 16 years of hell it took to get here. Most people think saving for a dream is about skipping a few lattes or canceling a streaming service, but for me and Sarah, it was a slow, bone-deep grind that wore grooves into our very souls. We weren't in Oppos. T born into money. We were born into grease and overtime shifts, and every dollar we put away for this lake house was a dollar we didn't in Oppos. T spent on new clothes or vacations, or even a car that didn't in Oppos. T rattle when you hit 40 miles an hour. We had a goal, a North Star that kept us going through the double shifts and the cold winters. And that was a quiet place on the water where Sarah could breathe. See, Sarah has this aggressive form of lupus, the kind that turns her joints into rusted hinges and makes every step feel like she's walking on hot coals. And the only thing that ever gave her a moment of relief was floating in cool, still water. So when we finally signed the deed to this 3-bedroom cabin on Mirror Lake, it wasn't in Oppos. T just a house. It was a sanctuary, a literal lifesaver. It was small, sure, and the siding was peeling, and the dock looked like it was held together by prayer and a few rusted nails, but it was ours, and it had 80 feet of shoreline that I promised Sarah would be her private paradise. But we hadn't an Oppos. T even finished unloading the U-Haul before the shadow of the lake made her first appearance. I remember the sound of those heels first, a sharp, rhythmic click-clack on the asphalt that sounded like a countdown to a bomb going off. I looked up, and there was Victoria standing on the edge of our driveway with a clipboard in one hand and a look of profound disappointment in the other, like she'd just discovered a cockroach in her caviar. She didn't in Oppos. T say hello. She didn't in Oppos. T offer a welcome to the neighborhood casserole. She just adjusted her sunglasses, the kind that cost more than my first truck, and sighed. And quote, "You must be the Miller in Oppos." And quote, she said, though it sounded more like an accusation than a greeting, and quote, "I'm Victoria, president of the Lakeview HOA, and I've already noticed 3 violations on your property that need to be addressed before nightfall." End quote. I just stood there, holding a box of Sarah's medical supplies, and blinked at her, trying to process how someone could be this intense before noon. She pointed a manicured finger at our dock and told me it was an eyesore that lowered the property values of the entire cove, and then she dropped the real bombshell. She claimed there was quote, traditional community easement, end quote, that ran right through our backyard and across our dock, meaning we couldn't in Oppos T-block access to anyone who wanted to use our shoreline for, end quote, recreational transit, end quote. I tried to explain that our deed was clear, that we own the land right down to the high water mark, but she just gave me this thin, oily smile and told me that, end quote, tradition trumps paper in this town, end quote, and that if I tried to be difficult, her husband, who just happened to be the head of the county and Oppos, Building and Safety Department, would make our lives very, very complicated. The next few months were a slow-motion car crash of legal threats and petty psychological warfare that started to eat away at Sarah's health faster than a lupus ever could. Every time Sarah went down to the water to try and float, Victoria would magically appear on her balcony with a megaphone, or she'd, accidentally, let her two massive Dobermans run loose through our yard, barking and snapping until Sarah was too terrified to leave the porch. Then came the, inspections, I wake up to find orange tags taped to our door for everything from, unauthorized lawn height, to, non-compliant mailbox color, and every appeal I filed disappeared into a black hole at the county office. It was a rigged game, a closed loop of suburban tyranny where Victoria was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and we were just the, low-rent interlopers, ruining her view. The breaking point came on the 4th of July, a day that was supposed to be our first real celebration in the new house. I had set up a small grill and a couple of chairs for Sarah so we could watch the fireworks over the water, but when we walked out back, our entire shoreline was occupied by about 40 people I'd never seen in my life. Victoria had organized a, community gala, and decided our backyard was the perfect place for the catering tents and the bar. When I told her to leave, she didn't oppose. To even look at me, she just signaled to a local sheriff's deputy, who was sipping a beer at her party, and he walked over, put a hand on his belt, and told me I was, interfering with a sanctioned community event, and that I should head inside before I got charged with disturbing the peace. I watched Sarah's face fall, her eyes welling up as she realized her, sanctuary, was just a playground for Victoria's friends, and that was the moment something in me finally snapped. I didn't oppose. To yell, I didn't oppose. To make a scene, I just took Sarah inside, sat her down with a heating pad, and spent the next 72 hours in a fever dream of research. I drove 3 counties over to the state archives because I knew I couldn't oppose. To trust anything in our local office, and I spent 2 days digging through dusty, yellowed property records and surveyor maps from the 1950s. I was looking for a needle in a haystack, a mistake, a crack in Victoria's armor, and on the 3rd afternoon, I found it. I was staring at a topographical map from 1958 when I realized the property lines for the entire cove had been redrawn in the late 80s when Victoria's father-in-law was on the town council. The, official, map everyone used now showed Victoria's property line ending right where our rose garden began, but the original state-certified deed showed something very different. Because of the way the lake had receded over the decades, the actual legal boundary of my property didn't oppose. To end at the edge of the grass, it extended nearly 30 feet into what Victoria thought was her private, manicured estate. I wasn't oppose. T just her neighbor. I legally owned half of her backyard, her entire outdoor kitchen, and the ground beneath her precious, illegal guest house. I hired a state-certified surveyor from the Capitol, a guy who didn't oppose. T know Victoria and didn't oppose. T care about her husband's influence, and I told him to mark every single inch of my land with bright pink stakes. Watching Victoria's face through the window while he hammered those stakes in her perfect lawn was better than any fireworks show I'd ever seen. She came out charging, ready to scream, but the surveyor just handed her a certified copy of the state filing and told her that if she touched a single stake, he'd have her arrested for interfering with a legal survey. But I wasn't oppose. T done yet, because the research had pulled back a curtain on a much bigger lie. It turned out that Victoria's husband had been using his position to bypass environmental permits for years, and that, guest house, she was so proud it was actually leaching gray water directly into the lake, a massive federal violation. I spent the next month quietly documenting everything, from the illegal dredging she'd done to make her beach deeper to the way her husband was, losing, the tax records for their cronies in the HOA. I was building a cage, and Victoria was too busy complaining about the color of my curtains to realize the bars were closing in. That's what led to the morning of the fence. I didn't oppose. T just built a garden fence. I built a 6-foot-tall industrial-grade cedar spite wall that followed the exact, zigzagging line of my legal property. which meant it went straight through her rose garden, cut her outdoor kitchen in half, and blocked her multi-million-dollar view of the sunset entirely. When the cops showed up, the ones Victoria had on speed dial, I just handed them the paperwork from the state attorney general's office. I told them they were more than welcome to stop the construction, but they'd have to explain to the federal EPA agents who were currently sitting in the county office why they were protecting an illegal construction site built on top of a contaminated shoreline. The look of pure, frozen terror on the deputy's face when he realized the, mechanic from the cabin, had brought in the big guns was worth every penny I'd spent on the surveyor. Within an hour, the scene was a circus. Local news vans were pulling up because I'd leaked the story about the, zoning scandal of Mirror Lake, and the neighbors Victoria had been bullying for years were coming out of their houses, not to help her, but to cheer for the fence. Victoria was a broken woman by noon. She was standing in the middle of her ruined roses, watching her husband get escorted into a black SUV by investigators from the State Corruption Task Force, while my crew finished the final section of the fence. She looked at me, her eyes wild and bloodshot, and she hissed, "You ruined everything. This was a perfect community until you brought your trashy life here." I just leaned against my new fence, sipped my coffee, and looked her dead in the eye. "No, Victoria," I said, my voice as calm as the lake, "I didn't oppose to ruin anything. I just moved the trash to the other side of the fence." By the end of the year, her husband was facing 10 years for racketeering and environmental fraud, and Victoria had to sell the fortress at a massive loss to pay for the legal fees and the fines for the lake contamination. The house is empty now, the glass is dusty, and the rose garden is nothing but weeds. But the best part? The fence is still there. Sarah is down at the water now, floating in the quiet cove that finally belongs to her, and the only sound you can hear is the wind in the pines. The community ended up dissolving the HOA entirely after the scandal broke, and it turns out when you don an oppose, to have a tyrant telling everyone what color their mailbox has to be, people are actually pretty decent to each other. But I still see the comments on the local forums sometimes, people arguing about whether I went too far, whether destroying a woman's entire life over a property line and a few mean words was justified or just cruel, Some folks say I'm a hero for standing up to a bully, and others say I'm no better than she was, that I used the system as a weapon just like her husband did. I don an oppose. Tino, maybe they an oppose. Rewrite. Maybe I did become the monster to beat the monster. But when I see Sarah smiling without wincing in pain for the first time in a decade, I find it real hard to lose sleep over a few ruined roses. So what do you think? Did I cross the line? Or is this just what happens when you push a quiet man too far? Drop a comment and tell me if I'm the villain of this story or the only one who had the guts to do what needed to be done, because I'm reading every single one of them, and I'm curious to see where you draw the line.